The room was freezing on the morning of December the 19th, 1944. A small stove in the corner did little to warm the stone barracks building in Verdun that housed Lieutenant General Omar Bradley's 12th Army Group headquarters. 16 officers sat in wooden folding chairs, their breath visible in the cold air, coats buttoned tight, smoking cigarettes and cigars that filled the room with haze. A large map covered one wall showing the disaster unfolding 70 miles to the north. 3 days earlier, 250,000 German troops had smashed through American lines in the Ardennes forest. 29 divisions supported by 1,000 tanks were driving west toward the Meuse River in Adolf Hitler's last desperate gamble to split the Allied armies and capture the vital port of Antwerp. The German advance had already penetrated 20 miles into Belgium. American units, some inexperienced, some exhausted from earlier fighting, were reeling backward under the assault. The crossroads town of Bastogne was nearly surrounded. If the Germans took it and its 7 converging roads, nothing would stop them from reaching the Meuse and perhaps beyond. General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, had called this emergency meeting to plan the Allied response. He tried to project confidence despite the grim situation. The present situation is to be regarded as one of opportunity for us and not of disaster, he told the assembled commanders. There will be only cheerful faces at this table. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Lieutenant General George Patton sat among the officers, pacing when he could, smoking a cigar, his manner outwardly cheerful, but his mind calculating distances, roads, fuel requirements. His Third Army was engaged in heavy fighting near Saarbrücken, preparing for an offensive into Germany through the Saar region. Now everything was about to change. Eisenhower outlined the situation. The Germans had achieved complete surprise. The scale of the attack was far larger than anyone had anticipated. American forces were holding the northern and southern shoulders of the bulge, but the center was collapsing. Bastogne had to be relieved. The German advance had to be stopped and then driven back. The plan would require Patton to disengage his forces from their current positions, pivot 90 degrees to the north, move over 100 miles through winter weather on inadequate roads, and attack into the southern flank of the German salient. It was a massive undertaking, the kind of operation that normally required weeks of planning, careful coordination of supply lines, detailed movement schedules for thousands of vehicles, ammunition redistribution, fuel allocation, and constant communication with subordinate units to ensure everyone understood their roles. Eisenhower turned to Patton. "George, I want you to command this move, under Brad's supervision, of course, making a strong counterattack with at least 6 divisions. When can you start?" Patton's response was immediate. "As soon as you're through with me, I can attack the day after tomorrow morning." The room fell silent. Several officers stared in disbelief. A few of the British officers present actually laughed, thinking Patton was making another of his characteristically boastful claims. Moving an entire army 90 degrees, relocating its headquarters, coordinating 3 corps with their supporting artillery, engineers, supply units, and medical facilities in the middle of winter, and then launching an offensive within 48 hours, seemed not just difficult but impossible. Bradley, Patton's direct superior, and one of his severest critics, wasn't laughing. He knew something the others didn't. Patton had come to this meeting prepared. The skepticism in that Verdun conference room reflected more than doubt about Patton's abilities. It revealed fundamental differences in how British and American commanders approached warfare in 1944, differences rooted in their nation's experiences and the armies they had built. The British Army that fought in Northwest Europe operated under constraints that shaped every decision its commanders made. The slaughter of the First World War remained seared into British consciousness. 700,000 British soldiers had died in that conflict, a generation lost to the trenches of France and Belgium. British society would never again tolerate such casual expenditure of lives. The doctrine that emerged from this trauma was explicit. Casualty avoidance must guide all operations. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery embodied this approach. He had fought in the Great War, been severely wounded, and watched countless men die in futile attacks. As commander of 21st Army Group, Montgomery developed an operational doctrine built around firepower dominance, careful planning, and overwhelming preparation before any offensive. "Let metal do it rather than flesh," his chief intelligence officer famously remarked. "Waste all the ammunition you like, but not lives." This philosophy produced a methodical approach to warfare. Montgomery's operations were set-piece battles, carefully orchestrated with massed artillery, close air support, and detailed coordination between all arms. Nothing was left to chance. Planning was exhaustive. Logistics were meticulously calculated. Alternative plans were developed for every contingency. Only when overwhelming force was assembled and every detail confirmed would Montgomery commit his troops. The British approach had strengths. Their planning was superb. Their logistics were efficient. Their administration, medical services, and communications were excellent. They concentrated force effectively and used artillery with devastating precision. When British operations succeeded, they did so with relatively modest casualties. Given the scale of combat, Montgomery preserved his army, a consideration driven partly by genuine care for his soldiers and partly by cold, strategic calculation. Britain needed an intact army for occupation duties in Germany and to maintain the empire after the war. But this methodology required time. Operations Market Garden in September 1944 illustrated both the approach and its limitations. Montgomery conceived a bold plan to seize bridges across the Rhine River in Holland, potentially ending the war by Christmas. The plan would employ 35,000 airborne troops in the largest airborne operation ever attempted. British Second Army would drive up a single road to relieve the paratroopers. Eisenhower approved the plan on September 10th. The operation launched on September 17th. 7 days for planning, preparation, and execution. For Montgomery, this represented hasty planning. The British airborne forces landed too far from their objectives. There were no planning maps created for the operation because there wasn't time. Commanders received their orders only 5 days before execution. As historians later noted, the planning and training for airborne drops at Sicily and Normandy had taken months. Market Garden had barely a week. The operation came tantalizingly close to success, but ultimately failed. British paratroopers fought heroically at Arnhem, but couldn't hold the bridge over the Rhine. Of 10,000 men who landed, only 2,000 made it back. Montgomery would later claim the operation was 90% successful, but the Rhine remained uncrossed, and the war would continue well past Christmas. The British method was not wrong. It suited Britain's circumstances, its manpower constraints, its political requirements, and its military culture. Montgomery's forces won battles and advanced steadily toward Germany, but the approach required time, resources, and careful preparation. When circumstances demanded rapid response, when speed mattered more than perfect coordination, when opportunity appeared suddenly and would vanish if not seized immediately, the British system struggled. In contrast, the American army that Patton commanded had developed a different philosophy entirely, one built not around preservation but around aggressive action and speed. George Patton had been thinking about a German offensive in the Ardennes since early November 1944. While other commanders dismissed the possibility, Patton watched intelligence reports accumulate. Radio intercepts suggested German units were moving into positions opposite the First Army's 8th Corps. The sector had been quiet for weeks after a failed American attack in the Hürtgen forest. That quietness worried Patton. On November 25th, he wrote in his diary, "First Army is making a terrible mistake leaving the 8th Corps static. It is highly probable that the Germans are building up east of them." His intelligence officer, Colonel Oscar Koch, shared these concerns. Koch had correctly predicted every major German action since Patton's Third Army landed in France. He saw patterns in the intelligence that others missed. On December 9th, Koch's section intercepted radio messages indicating German offensive preparations. Most Allied intelligence officers dismissed these signals as deception or considered them evidence of defensive preparations only. Koch believed otherwise. He sent a report to Supreme Headquarters warning of continuing German buildup east of First Army's 8th Corps area. The report was noted, but not acted upon. Patton trusted Koch's instincts. On December 12th, 4 days before the German offensive began, Patton ordered his staff to prepare contingency plans. If the Germans attacked through the Ardennes and Third Army was called to counterattack, what would be required? His staff officers went to work. They developed 3 separate operational plans, each designed for a different scenario. The first plan, codenamed Scent, would strike at the base of any German penetration, cutting it off at its root. The second and third plans involved different axes of attack depending on where Eisenhower wanted the main effort. Each plan detailed which divisions would move, which roads they would use, how supply lines would be reorganized, where ammunition dumps would be relocated, and how headquarters would displace forward. This was characteristic of Patton's command style. He believed in constant motion, relentless pressure, and seizing opportunity. His philosophy was simple. In war, you must always keep pushing forward or you will never achieve your objective. He had trained his staff to think ahead, to anticipate contingencies, to be ready to move instantly when ordered. When Bradley called on December 18th telling Patton to send his 10th Armored Division north and ordering him to Luxembourg for a meeting, Patton immediately understood what was coming. That evening he assembled his key staff officers. He explained the situation developing in the Ardennes. He outlined his 3 contingency plans. Once he attended the meeting at Verdun and learned what Eisenhower wanted, he would simply telephone his deputy, Major General Hobart Gay, and give a single code word. That word would activate whichever plan fit the situation. By midnight on December 18th, before the Verdun meeting ever occurred, one combat command of 4th Armored Division had already started moving north toward WWII. Throughout the night, Third Army staff officers worked on detailed movement orders. They calculated fuel requirements, identified choke points on the road network, coordinated with Corps commanders, and prepared communications procedures. This preparation was not luck or intuition. It was the product of a command philosophy fundamentally different from the British approach. Patton emphasized speed and aggression over perfect preparation. He believed opportunity in war was fleeting and had to be seized immediately. He accepted risk that British commanders would consider reckless. He pushed his subordinates hard, demanding they move faster, attack sooner, and maintain relentless pressure on the enemy. His staff had learned to work this way. They anticipated requirements. They prepared multiple options. They stayed flexible. When orders came, they could execute within hours rather than days or weeks. This methodology had been refined over 2 years of combat from North Africa through Sicily to France. Patton's Third Army was a machine designed for rapid maneuver, so when Patton told Eisenhower he could attack in 48 hours, he was not boasting. He was simply stating what his staff had already prepared and what his army was trained to execute. Patton left the Verdun conference at 9:15 on the morning of December the 19th. He walked to his staff car with Bradley and Eisenhower. still discussing details of the counterattack. As Eisenhower prepared to depart, a sergeant from a medical battalion approached and asked if he could have his photograph taken with the two generals. They agreed. Eisenhower told Patton to move over and let the soldier stand in the middle. Then Patton climbed into his vehicle for the drive back to his headquarters in Nancy. At 9:45, he telephoned his chief of staff, Major General Hobart Gay. The conversation was brief. Patton gave a single word: the code that activated the contingency plan his staff had been preparing since December 12th. Third Army's massive pivot north was officially underway. The scale of what happened next remains one of the most remarkable feats of military logistics in the Second World War. Patton had promised to attack with 3 divisions within 2 to 3 days. To fulfill that promise required moving the better part of an entire Army Corps over 100 miles through one of the worst winters Europe had experienced in decades, repositioning thousands of vehicles, relocating ammunition dumps, redirecting fuel supplies, and coordinating the movement of approximately 130,000 men with their supporting artillery, engineers, medical units, and supply trains. The divisions designated for the initial assault were Major General Hugh Gaffey's 4th Armored Division, Major General Willard Paul's 26th Infantry Division, and Major General Horace McBride's 80th Infantry Division. All 3 belonged to Major General John Milliken's 3rd Corps. These units were currently engaged in combat operations facing east toward Germany. They would have to disengage from their present positions, move west to assembly areas, then turn north to Luxembourg, and finally attack northeast into the German flank. The road network was inadequate for the task. The main routes north were 2-lane roads, many of them damaged by earlier fighting. Small towns and villages created bottlenecks where columns had to slow or stop. The weather was brutal. Heavy snow had fallen on December 17th and 18th. Temperatures dropped below freezing. Roads became sheets of ice. Visibility was poor. Fog settled into valleys and refused to lift. 4th Armored Division began moving first. Combat Command B started north toward Longway on the night of December 18th, even before the Verdun Conference. By December 20th, the entire division was in motion. Tanks, half-tracks, tank destroyers, self-propelled artillery, supply trucks, fuel tankers, and ammunition carriers moved in long columns that stretched for miles. Maintenance crews traveled with the divisions, ready to repair vehicles that broke down. Recovery vehicles pulled disabled tanks and trucks off the roads to keep traffic moving. The 26th Infantry Division, stationed at Metz, began moving on December 19th. Infantry rode in trucks, 2.5-ton vehicles that could carry 20 men with their weapons and equipment. Artillery battalions moved their 105 mm and 155 mm guns by truck and prime mover. Each battalion required dozens of vehicles just for the guns, ammunition, fire direction equipment, and communications gear. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The 80th Infantry Division, located at Saarbrücken, had the longest distance to travel. They began disengaging from German positions on December 19th, a delicate operation that required leaving enough forces in place to prevent the Germans from realizing the Americans were withdrawing. Regiment by regiment, the division pulled back, loaded onto trucks, and started the journey north. Third Army's supply system had to transform overnight. Fuel dumps that had been positioned to support an eastward offensive into the Saar now had to redirect their stocks north. Ammunition that had been stored near the German border had to be moved or abandoned. New supply points had to be established along the routes to Luxembourg and into Belgium. The complexity of moving an army reveals itself in details that rarely appear in history books. 4th Armored Division alone consisted of approximately 11,000 men, 263 medium tanks, 35 light tanks, 54 tank destroyers, 72 self-propelled artillery pieces, and thousands of other vehicles, including jeeps, trucks, half-tracks, and armored cars. Moving this force required planning at every level. Tank companies had to maintain proper intervals on the march to prevent massive traffic jams if one vehicle broke down. Each Sherman tank consumed roughly 1 gallon of gasoline per mile on roads, more in difficult terrain. A division moving 100 miles needed tens of thousands of gallons of fuel, all of which had to be transported by tanker trucks that themselves consumed fuel. Fuel dumps along the route had to be notified of, the volumes required, and the timing of arrival. Ammunition presented similar challenges. Each infantry division carried its basic load of ammunition, but sustained combat required resupply. Small arms ammunition, mortar rounds, artillery shells, anti-tank projectiles, and grenades all had different weights, storage requirements, and consumption rates. Ammunition trucks had to be positioned along the route and at the destination to ensure units could fight immediately upon arrival. The weather made everything harder. On December 20th, another snowstorm hit the region. Visibility dropped to near zero. Ice formed on roads faster than maintenance crews could spread sand or cinders. Vehicles slipped off roads into ditches. Tank tracks, designed for cross-country mobility, provided poor traction on ice-covered pavement. Drivers had to reduce speed to avoid collisions, which meant columns took longer to reach their destinations. Communication was critical. 3rd Army headquarters displaced forward from Nancy to Luxembourg City on December 20th. Command posts had to be established, telephone lines run, radio networks activated. Corps headquarters moved simultaneously. Division headquarters followed. Each level of command needed to maintain contact with units above and below in the chain of command, while also coordinating with adjacent units. Military police directed traffic at critical intersections, ensuring columns took the correct routes and preventing different units from creating gridlock at bottlenecks. Engineers worked to repair damaged bridges and reinforce those that might collapse under the weight of tanks. Medical units positioned themselves along the routes to treat soldiers injured in vehicle accidents or suffering from exposure to the cold. Despite all these obstacles, the movement proceeded with remarkable speed. By December 21st, elements of all 3 divisions were approaching their assembly areas in Luxembourg. Patton established his forward headquarters in the Pescatore Foundation building in Luxembourg City that same day. His headquarters staff had worked through 2 consecutive nights preparing operations orders, coordinating with corps commanders, and solving the thousands of logistical problems that arose. On December 22nd, 3rd Army attacked. The 80th Infantry Division struck toward the town of Ettelbruck. The 26th Infantry Division advanced toward Wiltz. 4th Armored Division drove toward Bastogne itself, still surrounded by German forces. The attack came exactly 3 days after the Verdun conference, precisely as Patton had promised. The contrast with traditional planning methodology was stark. A British-style operation of similar scale would have required weeks of preparation. Detailed plans would have been written and distributed to all units. Rehearsals would have been conducted. Supply dumps would have been carefully positioned. Artillery fire plans would have been calculated and coordinated. Air support would have been arranged in advance. None of these things happened for Patton's counterattack. Units moved while still receiving their orders. Supply arrangements were improvised on the move. Artillery went into action from hasty positions. There were no rehearsals, no detailed fire plans, no carefully coordinated air-ground operations. The attack was not elegant or perfectly coordinated. It was fast, aggressive, and relentless. The movement itself demonstrated a fundamentally different approach to warfare. Where British doctrine emphasized overwhelming preparation, American doctrine under Patton emphasized speed and momentum. Where Montgomery required certainty before committing forces, Patton accepted risk and chaos as inevitable costs of maintaining initiative. The road to Bastogne was hell. 4th Armored Division fought for every mile against German forces trying desperately to prevent relief of the surrounded town. The 4th Combat Command B, led by Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, pushed north through Martelange on December 23rd. German resistance was fierce. Artillery fire rained down on the American columns. Anti-tank guns positioned in villages knocked out Sherman tanks at close range. The advance measured in hundreds of yards per day, sometimes less. Weather remained terrible. Snow continued falling. Temperatures stayed below freezing. Visibility was so poor that tank commanders couldn't see more than a few hundred yards. The narrow roads forced tanks and vehicles into single file, making them vulnerable to ambush. When German anti-tank fire disabled the lead tank, the entire column stopped until engineers could push the wreck aside or recovery vehicles could tow it away. Inside Bastogne, the situation was desperate. The 101st Airborne Division and elements of other units, approximately 15,000 men, had been surrounded since December 20th. They were running low on ammunition and medical supplies. Food was scarce. The wounded filled cellars and basements that served as improvised aid stations. German artillery pounded the town continuously. On December 22nd, the German commander sent a surrender demand to Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, commanding the Bastogne defenders. McAuliffe's reply was a single word: nuts. Patton visited forward units daily, pressing commanders to move faster, attack harder, and maintain pressure. He understood that speed was everything. The longer Bastogne remained surrounded, the weaker its defenders became. The longer 4th Armored Division took to break through, the more time the Germans had to reinforce their positions. Every hour mattered. On December 23rd, the weather finally cleared. Allied aircraft filled the skies. Fighter bombers attacked German positions. Transport planes dropped supplies to the Bastogne garrison. The air support helped, but the ground advance remained slow and costly. German defenders fought with the desperation of men who knew they were losing the war but refused to surrender. On December 26th, late in the afternoon, elements of 4th Armored Division's Combat Command Reserve broke through the German lines south of Bastogne. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams led the final push. His tanks smashed through the last German defensive positions and reached the Bastogne perimeter. The siege was broken. Exactly 1 week after the Verdun conference, Patton had fulfilled his promise. The corridor to Bastogne was narrow, only about 500 yards wide at some points. German forces immediately counterattacked, trying to close it. Fighting continued for days as American forces worked to widen the corridor and strengthen the defensive line. But the critical objective had been achieved. Bastogne was no longer isolated. Patton drove through the corridor into Bastogne shortly after it was opened. He toured the battered town, saw the destruction from German bombardment, met with McAuliffe and his exhausted defenders. On January 14, 1945, he pinned the Distinguished Service Cross on McAuliffe in a ceremony held amid the ruins. The relief of Bastogne became one of the defining moments of the Battle of the Bulge. American forces had absorbed a massive German attack, held critical positions, and then counterattacked with speed that caught the Germans off balance. The German offensive, Hitler's last gamble in the West, had failed. The initiative had shifted permanently to the Allies. What made Patton's achievement remarkable was not just the military success, but the speed of execution. He had taken an army engaged in one offensive, pivoted it 90 degrees, moved it over 100 miles in winter conditions, and launched a new offensive in 72 hours. No army in the world could match this performance. The British certainly couldn't. Even the Germans, famous for mobile warfare, would have required more time for such an operation. The contrast revealed everything about how different armies fought and what different philosophies of command could achieve. The Battle of the Bulge continued for weeks after Bastogne was relieved. American forces pushed back German gains throughout January 1945. By the end of the month, the Allies had reclaimed all territory lost to the German offensive. The bulge in the Allied lines was eliminated. German forces withdrew behind their original defensive positions, having accomplished nothing except the destruction of their own remaining offensive capability. The cost was staggering. American casualties totaled approximately 81,000 men killed, wounded, or missing. German casualties exceeded 100,000. Hundreds of tanks and vehicles were destroyed on both sides. The German losses were irreplaceable. Germany's strategic reserve, carefully hoarded for the offensive, was gone. The men, tanks, fuel, and ammunition expended in the Ardennes could never be reconstituted. For the German war effort, the bulge was catastrophic. Hitler had gambled everything on achieving a decisive victory that would split the Allied armies and force a negotiated peace in the West. When that gamble failed, Germany had no reserves left to defend against the inevitable Allied offensives that would come in spring. The road to Berlin lay open. For the Allies, the battle demonstrated both vulnerabilities and strengths. American intelligence had failed to predict the offensive. The initial German surprise was complete. Units holding the Ardennes sector were either inexperienced or exhausted, exactly as Bradley had gambled when he thinly defended that region. The gamble nearly proved disastrous. But the American response, once the shock wore off, was remarkably effective. Eisenhower immediately grasped the situation and issued orders to contain the German advance. Critical crossroads like Bastogne were reinforced. Fuel and ammunition were moved out of the German path. Reserves were committed to hold the northern and southern shoulders of the penetration. And Patton's Third Army executed its rapid counterattack that prevented the Germans from consolidating their gains. The battle revealed something fundamental about American military capability in 1944. The United States had built an army designed for mobility and aggressive action. American doctrine emphasized speed, flexibility, and maintaining initiative through relentless offensive pressure. American logistics, though often criticized, proved capable of supporting rapid maneuvers across great distances, even in terrible weather. Patton's achievement at Bastogne became legendary precisely because it embodied these American strengths: his willingness to accept risk, his emphasis on speed over perfect preparation, his demand that subordinates move faster and attack sooner, and his staff's ability to plan and execute complex operations with minimal preparation time, all represented a distinctly American approach to warfare. This approach had weaknesses. American attacks were often less carefully coordinated than British operations. American casualties in some battles were higher than necessary because units attacked before all supporting elements were in place. American commanders sometimes made mistakes that better preparation might have prevented. Patton himself was notorious for pushing his forces so hard that they occasionally outran their supply lines. But the approach also had decisive advantages when circumstances demanded rapid action, when opportunity appeared suddenly, when speed mattered more than perfect coordination, when the enemy was off balance and needed to be hit before he could recover. The American system excelled. Patton's army could do things that no British formation could match. The contrast with British methodology was not about competence or courage. British soldiers fought with extraordinary bravery throughout the war. British planning and logistics were superb. Montgomery's victories in North Africa and his steady advance through northwest Europe demonstrated the effectiveness of his methods. British forces accomplished their missions and did so while preserving their army for the long war they knew they were fighting. The contrast was about philosophy, priorities, and what each nation's circumstances demanded. Britain, fighting since 1939, exhausted by 5 years of war, with limited manpower reserves and global imperial commitments, needed an approach that minimized casualties and preserved combat power. America, with vast industrial capacity, large population, and millions of men in uniform, could afford to emphasize speed and accept the risks that came with rapid maneuver. What happened at Verdun on December 19, 1944, was more than just Patton making a bold claim and then fulfilling it. It was a moment that crystallized fundamental differences in how armies could be commanded and what different philosophies could achieve. The story often gets told as Patton the genius versus everyone else's doubt. The movie version features George C. Scott declaring he can attack in 48 hours while skeptical British officers laugh. This narrative is satisfying but incomplete. The real story is more complex and more interesting. Patton's rapid response was not the product of individual genius alone. It was the culmination of a command system designed specifically to enable such responses. His intelligence officer had been tracking German movements for weeks. His staff had been wargaming contingencies since early December. His divisions were trained to move quickly and attack from hasty positions. His logistics system, whatever its imperfections, was built around supporting mobile operations. His corps and division commanders understood his expectations and knew how to execute without detailed instructions. In short, Patton could promise to attack in 48 hours because his entire army was organized around the principle that speed and aggression mattered more than perfect preparation. This was not recklessness. It was a conscious choice about how to fight, backed by training, doctrine, and organizational culture that reinforced that choice at every level. Montgomery's 21st Army Group could not have executed such an operation. This was not because British soldiers were inferior or British commanders incompetent. It was because the British Army was designed around different principles that produced different capabilities. Montgomery's forces excelled at carefully planned set-piece battles with overwhelming firepower. They could not execute hasty attacks from unprepared positions because their entire system was built around avoiding exactly that kind of operation. Neither approach was objectively superior. Each had strengths and weaknesses. Each suited the nation that employed it. The question was not which was better in some abstract sense, but which was appropriate for specific circumstances. The bulge demanded speed. The Germans had achieved surprise and were driving west. Every hour they gained allowed them to advance further, capture more supplies, and threaten more critical objectives. Waiting for perfect preparation would have been disastrous. The situation required immediate counteraction, even if that meant attacking before everything was ideally positioned. Patton's system was designed for exactly this scenario. He could respond immediately because immediate response was what his army practiced constantly. The cost was accepting higher risk of things going wrong, accepting that coordination would be imperfect, accepting that some units would go into battle before they were fully prepared. Montgomery's system would have responded differently. He would have insisted on more time to prepare, more careful coordination, more complete logistics arrangements. His attack, when it came, would have been more powerful and better supported, but it would have come days or weeks later, by which time the situation might have deteriorated beyond recovery. The historical record shows what happened. Patton attacked on December 22nd, 3 days after the Verdun Conference. his forces fought their way to Bastogne and broke the siege on December 26th. The German offensive was stopped and then reversed. American forces regained all lost ground by the end of January. Whether Montgomery could have done better is unknowable. He was given command of the northern sector of the Bulge, where his forces, including elements of British 30th Corps, helped contain the German advance. Montgomery's methodical approach worked in that sector, but the critical decision point was Bastogne, and there Patton's speed proved decisive. The battle demonstrated that different situations demand different approaches. No single philosophy of command works for all circumstances. Flexibility, the ability to recognize what a situation demands and respond appropriately, matters more than rigid adherence to any particular doctrine. In that freezing room in Verdun on December 19, 1944, when Patton said he could attack in 48 hours, he was stating a truth that many present could not accept. The truth was uncomfortable because it challenged assumptions about how armies had to be commanded, how much time operations required, and what was possible under difficult conditions. For British officers schooled in methodical planning, trained to prepare exhaustively before committing forces, and operating under a doctrine that emphasized certainty over speed, Patton's claim seemed absurd. They laughed because they were measuring his statement against their own capabilities and finding it impossible. They were not wrong about what their army could do. They were wrong about what Patton's army could do. This misunderstanding revealed the danger of assuming all armies operate the same way. Different training, different doctrine, different organizational culture, and different national circumstances create armies with fundamentally different capabilities. What is impossible for one force may be routine for another. Recognizing these differences matters for allies trying to coordinate operations and for planners trying to predict what enemies can achieve. The American soldiers who executed Patton's pivot north paid for speed with hardship. They drove through snowstorms on icy roads. They went into battle from hasty positions without complete supply arrangements. They attacked strong points without the massive artillery preparation that British forces would have demanded. They accepted risks that more cautious commanders would have considered unacceptable. Many died in the fighting for Bastogne. 4th Armored Division suffered heavy casualties breaking through the German lines. Infantry divisions attacking on the flanks lost men to German artillery and counterattacks. The quick response that saved Bastogne cost American lives. Whether a slower, more carefully prepared operation would have cost fewer lives is impossible to know. The defenders of Bastogne might not have survived long enough for a more methodical relief. The Battle of the Bulge was the largest and bloodiest battle American forces fought in Western Europe. It came at a moment when many believed the war was nearly over, when soldiers hoped they might survive to return home, when the end seemed tantalizingly close. Instead, they faced one more desperate battle in freezing conditions against an enemy who refused to accept inevitable defeat. For those who fought through the Ardennes in December 1944 and January 1945, the experience was searing. Survivors remembered the cold, the fear, the friends who died, the exhaustion of fighting day after day with inadequate rest. They remembered German artillery fire, the distinctive sound of German machine guns, the sight of burning tanks and shattered villages. They also remembered the moment when the tide turned, when American reinforcements arrived, when the German advance stopped and then reversed, when it became clear that Hitler's gamble had failed. They remembered the relief of victory hard won through determination and sacrifice. The story of Patton's 48-hour response to the Bulge is often told as a tale of military genius and American exceptionalism. The reality is more nuanced. It is a story about how different armies fight differently based on their circumstances, training, and philosophy. It is a story about the advantages and costs of emphasizing speed over preparation. It is a story about what was possible when an army was designed from its foundation around the principle of aggressive action. Most of all, it is a story about the men who did the actual fighting, who drove through blizzards, who attacked fortified positions, who died in frozen fields far from home so that others might live, and the cause they served might triumph. They deserve to be remembered not just for the speed of their response, but for the price they paid to achieve it. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.